Good afternoon, members. Today we're being joined by Professor Kathleen Stock, a former philosophy professor before she resigned at the University of Sussex, citing the attacks she received by her colleagues and students due to her views. Her book, Material Girls, has received wide notoriety for these views and her opposition to proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act. A quick word from me about the format tonight. We'll be doing the Q&A from the dispatch boxes. If you'd prefer to ask your question from your seat, that is absolutely fine. And if you just, after you put your hand up, if you stay stood where you are, someone will come over with a microphone. We've chosen to do this format in order to allow all our members to engage with and challenge with Professor Stock's views on what we believe is an incredibly important conversation and debate on this issue. So thank you to Professor Stock for agreeing to take part in this discussion, and welcome to the Oxford Union. So, Professor Stock, I thought we'd start just by sort of setting the intellectual parameters of this discussion. And so you've said in your book that one thing that you don't care about is sort of people having their own inner gender identities, but it's when these private beliefs become reified into law that you have a problem. I was wondering if you could just sort of clarify exactly what your problem is by what you see as a reification of a fiction.
Oh, well, I don't think gender identity is a fiction, actually. So, and when you say I don't care about it, actually, I think gender identity, unlike some of my fellow feminists, I actually think people can have gender identities. I just certainly don't think everyone does, but I think some people feel some kind of way about their sex bodies that leads them to feel that they're more masculine than their female body, or they're more feminine than their male body. But what I think is crazy is to try and have laws and policies based on what is essentially something totally internal that no one else can see. And transactivism tells us all the time that no one can tell you what your gender identity is, only you can know. And we're supposed to accept what someone says about their gender identity as soon as they say it. And if that is the basis on which people are getting access to certain spaces where women are vulnerable, or sports teams, or shortlists, or whatever it is, it's just way too open to malfeasance.
And on that sort of question of the morality of trans women's access to those spaces, in your book, you set this out in fairly utilitarian terms. And you say, and I quote, that the harms to trans people, quote, need to be considered alongside the potential costs of effectively allowing any male at all into places where females are unusually vulnerable to sexual assault. On balance, I don't think the former harm outweighs the latter. And I think that most people would perhaps agree with you if the evidence suggested that allowing trans women, or perhaps their male impersonators, into female-only spaces would result in a marked rise in sexual violence against women. My question to you is, if the evidence actually showed the contrary, that there was no increase in the violence committed to cis women, and that, on the contrary, by not doing the proposed changes, trans women experienced greater harm themselves, would you change your view on their inclusion to these spaces?
So no evidence of an increase in violence against women compared to what? So
compared to the status quo, i.e., as in if we now say that people can self-identify and go into a bathroom, and as a result of that, we do not see there is no greater rise in, just hypothetically, in an appearance.
So if by some amazing turn of events, a male-bodied person saying, I am a woman, somehow automatically took them out of the patterns of male violence for their sex, and meant that from then on they were just I imagine in this thought experiment we're reducing them to the patterns of violence, sexual violence of women, for instance, and women are already in changing rooms, so if that's the thought experiment, And if we could establish this, I think we're talking about quite a far away possible world myself, but if we could establish this, then yes, I'm not a fanatic.
Sure.
So yes, if we could establish that. Of course, I don't think we can establish that, because I think we live in this world where males show the patterns of violence that they do.
Yeah, but the reason you come to that conclusion is on a sort of utilitarian calculus.
It's funny to hear you say that I'm utilitarian, because I would normally not think of myself that way. But I do think when it comes to policies and you're balancing interests, you have to take, especially when it comes to safeguarding, because safeguarding is an area where you're supposed to be quite paranoid. You're supposed to have extra safeguarding in, even though not every male predates, but you still, say in the safeguarding of children, you do a lot of things to stop that paedophile from becoming the nursery teacher or whatever, extra things. And that's not to say that every nursery teacher is a paedophile, ridiculous. So in the area of changing rooms or prisons or whatever it is where women are getting undressed, you're supposed to do extra stuff. And when we took all the males out before, as it were, as far as we could, it wasn't on the assumption that all males were predators. Far from it. It was on the assumption that some are, a few are, but that they are determined and that this will increase their opportunity. So we want to rationally take into account the interests of women who are in those spaces. And up until now, up until recently, we have not been doing that as a society. The way this discourse goes, nobody seems to care about the women. And that's what I care about.
So let's break down the risks as you see it. So one risk is of male impersonators. Is that a fair characterization? It's
a risk of a man saying he's a woman and going into space and taking advantage of that. Now, there's an extra discussion about whether that person is genuinely trans or not, because transactivism has cast the net of trans women so wide that you'd be very hard-pressed to have a definition which said they weren't. But if you want to have that sort of no true trans woman sort of thing, no one that ever committed sexual violence against women could possibly be a real trans woman, you could do that. I'm not sure how it would work.
I think there's surely a distinction between a trans woman who commits sexual violence against women and someone who, in every other aspect of their life, identifies as a cis man and then says, I'm a trans woman, only to go into a space.
There is, but there's also a massive penumbra of different circumstances between those two, partly cross-dressing, someone who's enjoying being able to go into changing rooms on a regular basis. And those people, I'm not naive about male sexuality. Yeah. I'm afraid those people do exist.
But for the type who are not bona fide, genuine trans women, if they go into these spaces and commit sexual violence, is the issue here not one of identification and access, but one of the legislation to police and enforce against sexual violence? As in, these spaces are not that typically policed. So
no, exactly.
Currently there are not that many things, even without any inclusive legislation, that would stop just a cis man from walking in without even having to say that they're a trans woman. So I think my question is, when we look at that harm, how much of it is derivative of this potential change and how much just exists within the status quo?
Well, the thing about that status quo argument, which comes up a lot, which is basically, although you didn't put it this crudely, look, women are already going to get raped, so what does it matter? I mean, you didn't put it like that, but okay, status quo, yes, those spaces are not policed. There's no security guard on the door, thank God, because we haven't got the resources and it would be kind of weird. So most changing rooms, for instance, operate on a shared understanding of social norm. And that's all we have, is the shared understanding of the social norm that up until, 20 years ago, with some exceptions, but females would go in this space and males would go in that space. And when you've got the well-understood social norm, you can afford to be relaxed about the edge cases.
I think one of the sort of criticisms you've probably heard a lot is that your argument places too much emphasis on biological factors when it comes to the potential harms that might arise from allowing those who are natal males but trans women access into these spaces. Obviously, it's an evidenced fact that natal men have far higher likelihood to commit sexual violence against women, but does that derive purely from biological factors, or are there societal factors as well? And if there are societal factors, do some of those not change when a natal man transitions to a trans woman?
Okay, so yes, it's a combination of biology and social factors. I don't think men are born to sexually assault women, although I do think that testosterone has, basically everything about human behavior is a combination of genetic background, biology, and social organization. And obviously there are some societies that have massive violence against women, and there are some societies that don't, but the biology is shared. But that's not to say that biology is irrelevant either. It's complicated, as most things about the interaction between the human and the social world are. However, to concede that, which is not really a concession, I absolutely would be happy to admit that, the bit that I never did understand about current trans activism is that it seems to think that you could just leap to the end. So say that we admit, okay, you can socialize men out of sexual violence. Well, surely we should have a game plan, like maybe we should say, right, at the very end of this process, we will have self-ID, but we're not going to start with self-ID as the means by which we change the social order. Self-ID is the thing that you do at the very end, if we're right, when you've tamed everybody or whatever you're supposed to have done socially. But so, no, I don't think that, and remember that the context in which I came into this debate was not when the Gender Recognition Act came in, it was when self-ID was on the table as a policy that every single party was signed up to. So it wasn't about surgically transitioned, hormonally altered people. It was about anybody, basically anybody, saying, I am now a female and I can come into this space. So do I think that changes their social relationship to females? Absolutely, I do not.
But surely, though, if you are a trans woman and you're in one of the most marginalized groups that is the recipient of a huge amount of violence, would you not concede that you are then less likely to commit violence against cis women than a cis man would be? Or do you not?
No, that's just not how human psychology works, I'm afraid. There's a number of assumptions there I would want to unpick, and one of them which we hear all the time, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to say the heretical thing, is that Britain is quite a liberal society, and we have far more racist violence than we have transphobic violence in this country. So that is a message that's come through trans activism and has been repeated uncritically by many a media outlet, and is backed up by Stonewall surveys where they ask people, have you ever felt aggressed? So a lot of those surveys are based on people's reported feelings, and that's not the way you would normally look at levels of violence. It's complicated because obviously convictions are not going to absolutely represent crime, but certainly you shouldn't just go around to a bunch of people and say, do you feel like you've been a victim of a hate crime lately? And particularly not when you're telling them that a hate crime is to misgender them. So, in other words, I would push back a bit on that first assumption, but let's say that I grant you that assumption. I'm afraid it doesn't follow that people that are subject to violence are not violent. I think you need to talk to some criminologists. Okay,
but I think just to push back against that, I think that presumably, even if in that case that the reason I've given you don't think is likely, I find it hard to believe that what we take to be true of the natal subset of men, i.e. that as a group is likely to commit sexual violence as women, must necessarily hold true for the natal subset of men that want to transition to be a woman. Because surely those are two very different groups.
Why?
And I think,
why are they different groups?
Because one thinks that they are a man, feels comfortable in their body, and one wants to reject everything about being a natal man. And so I think the subtitle to your book, Why Reality Matters, I think that throughout a lot of your arguments, what some critics of you might say is that you cherry pick what reality means. Because as well as being a biological reality, surely there is a reality to those who say, I am not a man. And whether you agree with that or not, I think it's a huge assumption for you to then say, nothing about that reality, even if we say it's just their reality, will have an impact on the likelihood they are to commit sexual violence or anything else.
Well,
unless there's some evidence to back up your claim.
Can I point you to some statistics then? And these statistics are uncomfortable to say, and it's why very often they don't get mentioned, because my detractors automatically think I'm talking about all trans women when I raise them. And so I just want to preface this by saying that I absolutely am not saying that all trans women are violent. I have never said that. I say that opposite in the book. I just need to make that absolutely clear before I go into the statistics. In the same way, if I was about to mention male pattern violence statistics, I would not be saying that every man in this chamber is likely to assault somebody. I don't think you are. I have 2 sons. I have happy relationships with men. I'm not, I just have to stress this. However, Ministry of Justice statistics on the number, so if you take the number of trans women in prison in Britain, and you get the same stat in the US statistics, at least 50% are in there for sexual assault, okay? So, and then that's a higher rate than the average male. Now, that is not to say that I am saying that there's something about being a trans woman that makes you violent. I am saying that we need to look at those. You asked me to provide some evidence. I provided you some evidence. I hate to be the one that keeps having to tell people this sort of thing, because it absolutely, is the sort of thing that these people outside totally misunderstand about what I'm saying. But somebody has to say it. You can go and look at the stats yourself.
Well, so let's have a reasoned debate about the stats, because so the first point is, you said it's not about being all trans. Sorry if I misrepresented my question, but I don't think that, of course, that's not what I was trying to construe. The question is whether it is a statistically significant number as to cause a greater harm that we need to weigh.
Well, I thought you were looking for some evidence that there was that something,
Exactly.
You're suggesting that somehow, it seems to me that you're suggesting that a male-bodied person who says I'm a woman, because they really feel like a woman, want to reject everything about stereotypically about being a male, including sexual assault, if that's a stereotype at all about males, which I don't know. And I'm saying, well, look, there are actually quite a high number, relatively speaking, of trans women in prison who have, even though they say they're female, committed sexual assault. So that seems to suggest that there is not this amazing transformation.
Absolutely. Well, just to quickly clarify, my point wasn't that trans women want to reject the stereotype that men are violent, but rather there are clearly different societal experiences of trans women and men, and one of the results of that might be a decrease in violence. And so when we're talking about evidence, what would you say about Hashenbush's paper on non-discrimination laws in Massachusetts, where the researchers compared localities that had passed self-ID and those that hadn't, and the resounding outcome was that in both compared to before and after the passage of those bills, there was no statistical increase in violence or privacy-related crimes in women's-only spaces.
When was this paper?
2019.
Okay.
I agree with you to say that the evidence isn't conclusive at the moment.
Well, what I say in the book is that we need to go and look, and that is certainly a piece of evidence I would want to look at. In my experience, when I've Googled, for instance, when I was writing the book, and especially America, where I really think that this issue is much more talked about here than it is even in America, I would find a strange phenomenon where you couldn't find, trans women in changing rooms assault so-and-so, but you could find cross-dressing man, right? So there would be this distinction made. As soon as a man cross-dressing was found in a changing room or wherever, where he shouldn't have been, he was automatically assumed to be a malfeasant, well, obviously he was, but also a cross-dresser as opposed to a real trans woman. And so if that's the distinction that's being made, it's going to affect the stats, because you're going to find that anyone you find there is going to turn out to be in the wrong category. So I would want to look at their categories. I would also just want to look how hard they're looking. And I also want to talk to the women who are using these facilities.
As in, I can't answer any of those questions. But so moving away from looking at the side of the scale that affects cis women using these spaces already.
It affects all women using these spaces. I mean, I don't use cis.
Well,
anyway.
I will, but do you accept that there'll be harm caused to trans women by not letting them enter these spaces? Because presumably, if we think that if there's a reason for there to be sex-segregated bathrooms because men are likely to, or more likely, or there's a high chance of men committing sexual violence, if the way I see it is if a trans woman then has to go into a male bathroom, they will be perhaps visibly identifiable. Everyone in there is a man. Surely they are at immense risk of those exact same things.
Yeah.
And so why then does that not seem to be a relevant moral factor?
Well, you haven't read the final chapter of my book. Because
I have.
Because I agree with you. And I'm not saying that all trans women, no matter what they look like, no matter what surgical intervention they've had, should be in the males. I'm saying that if we have enough resources to throw millions at Stonewall, for instance, we can use some of that into lobbying for a range of spaces that protects everybody.
Well, I think that just on the sort of, you know, on the sort of on the third alternative of creating a third space, I think that most trans people would have two responses to that. First is that, one, it is currently impractical given the numbers and the thing that there are public bathrooms nearly everywhere throughout the country, so the infrastructure investment would be impossible.
Yeah, it'd be difficult.
And even if it wasn't, that it is somewhat subordinating. I have read the final chapter of your book. But talking on your book, my question then to you is why then in your chapter Why Sex Matters, when you say we should also consider the harms to trans people, the only harm you mention is there might be missexed, which is an emotional harm. And I put to you that there seems to be a discrepancy between the value between the attention to the harm to cis women than to that of trans women, because there is clearly a potential for physical harm, and I don't think that that is properly addressed.
So, okay, reasonable. So I've conceded, I mean, I don't know if that's fair or not, because I do say right up the front, and I take it as a given that I fully want trans people generally to be protected from violence and discrimination. It is true that writing that book in the context in which I was writing it, was the first mainstream publisher to ever publish anything pretty much gender critical. I was looking at women. It's true. I was looking at women and girls and children to some extent. And because there's a very, very loud voice talking all the time about harms to trans women in change rooms and all the rest of it, and I kind of was rhetorically positioning myself with the assumption that that bit was covered, at least people thought that already, and I was trying to say, no, but what about all this stuff that we're not paying attention to? I also, you know, for what it's worth, there's a big, strong view in trans activism that people like me should not be talking about what's good for trans people, and to some extent, I don't know, I mean, I think it would have pissed people off even more had I come up with lots and lots of solutions for trans people, but I did say in the end that I thought that we need male, female, and something like gender neutral. And is it so hard to resource? I mean, I think there's a bit of tension in the trans activist position because we've been told this is a massive problem, a social problem that's so enormous, causes such distress. You know, they're really at risk of violence. I mean, I know trans women that use male bathrooms a lot, and they don't say, they think they're not at risk of violence. So it depends where you are. So if it's this much of a problem, why can't we resource it? We're sort of being told it is a problem, but at the same time, it'd be too impractical to do that. So why not just have the trans women go in the female? And that doesn't seem fair.
Well, I think that beyond the question of resourcing, there's also a question of subordinating the protection, and then a third
what
category.
Does that mean?
Well, as in by creating, saying, okay, well, you know, we need to do this, and even if we could resource it up to the point, you know, as in, would you be happy, say, up to the point that we've created a third solution, trans people can use women's bathrooms?
Why? I mean, are we talking, for a start, the problem is practicality. We're in a landscape now that's completely different to the one that I was in 20 years ago. I mean, I've used bathrooms with trans women, passing trans women. I knew they were trans women. I was fine with it. You know, I never had a problem. But we are in a completely altered context. We're in a context which, as you know, the sole mantra of the entire trans activist world, including Stonewall and all the rest of it, is self-ID, nothing to do with passing. You want a male-bodied person who looks like any male here to be able to go into this bathroom, which means any male can go into this bathroom because the social norm is now collapsed. Basically, it's, what is it, on feels? Like, what is it? So it's just not practical that we could have these male-bodied people going into the female spaces. It's not fair on the females. Like, why on earth should females take this burden on? That's what I don't understand.
So on your point about passing trans people, I think we should move the conversation slightly to gender identity, slightly more than just the policy. Why do you think it's relevant that someone's passing? If your view is that gender is linked to biology and you can't change the biology, you can't change the sex, why does it matter whether someone's passing or not?
It matters for the social norm, right? So it doesn't matter for the category, as far as I'm concerned. I'm afraid passing or not, they haven't changed category. But if we're still on the policy question and the practical question, then a passing trans woman looks like a woman. That's the definition of passing, and to the visual appearance, identical. So when they come into a female space, they don't disrupt the social norm.
But if they are a natal man, are they not as likely, in your own metric, to commit a harm as someone who isn't like that?
This is where pragmatism comes into policy, because I don't think that they are less likely to. They don't, as I've said, they don't sort of get themselves out of the male pattern just by transitioning.
Yeah.
However, I don't think this is look at all the changing rooms and how they operate. As I've said, they're not policed, and I say this in the book, they're not policed. We don't want them to be policed. We don't want people saying, have you got a character reference before you can come in here? It's just not possible. So all we have is the norm, the appearance norm. Now, it's an imperfect norm, and it means that some people are misgendered. It means that some people feel very uncomfortable in certain spaces, but I don't know what other norm we can have that would protect women.
So one of the anonymous questions that we received prior to this talk was this. Can you define woman in a way that does not use normative language about biology? That is, define woman in a way that captures all people that you want without saying what things the female body should do? That's a misunderstanding of my position. And
I don't blame this person because they are obviously up to their neck in Judith Butler or whatever, Michel Foucault, but I don't think categories are normative. I don't think biological categories are normative. I think they have normative consequences, perhaps, but I don't think they're essentially normative. So I think if you say male, female, you are not setting up any kind of prescriptive norm for bodies, or even, chromosomes maybe, but there are males that aren't human. So there are females that aren't human that have different chromosomes to us. So the only norm is, are you on a pathway to produce, if this is the simplest one, are you on a pathway to produce large gametes or small gametes? And then different bodies will, because biology varies, there's genetic drift, there's all sorts of variation, but bodies are going to vary, and I'm saying nothing about that.
But is it not normative to step from that biology and that biological binary that I think we can accept, or I'm happy to accept at least, it's then a normative statement to apply that to gender. Lots of societies going, from Hindu, Judaism, indigenous societies in North America have had different ideas of gender based on different biologies. So surely can you step away from the normative aspect of it?
Well, what do you mean by gender is the question, because as I say in the book, there's about 4 different meanings. If you mean social stereotypes, then obviously they vary.
Even sex, like a Gallian one-sex model in 16th century Europe. Throughout history, we've had different conceptions of this.
Yeah, so some are better than others.
Okay, but on that, then we started tonight with asking about you saying that the worry is reifying gender theories into policy without considering harm. Do you think it's fair to say you're committing the same fallacy, namely reifying your own theory of gender identity, namely that it's all biology, into policy, irrespective of the harm it causes trans people? Or is that an unfair characterization?
It's a bit complicated, that question, but basically my position is there are bodies that are given to us by nature. We're products of evolution, we're animals, we reproduce sexually through the male and the female getting it together, and that has consequences on average for the average body shape, and the average size and the average limb length and heart size and lung length and chromosomes, and there are always variations, but on average, and then that will have social repercussions. And in any society, there will be a gender in the sense of social cultural stereotypes around maternity, around pregnancy, around any biological event that's important in the life of a human. Now, am I reifying that? I don't know what that means, actually.
Well, you use the term in the book, so...
Yeah, but I know what it means in that context. What does it mean in this context?
In the context of taking your theory and saying that is the truth, that is reality, and therefore that is going to be the basis of law. Whereas if we say that actually this is a bit more of a complex question, or that even if that is the case, what about the reality of the harm to trans people? Is that
look, I'm taking it. It's a false binary you're giving me here. I am taking into account the harms to trans people. It's not either or. Firstly, I don't make the laws, obviously. Secondly, yes, I think it's the truth because I'm a philosopher, so I tend to think the things I believe are the truth, having thought about them. You think the things you believe are the truth, having thought about them. It's not like I'm not being weird.
I think I and others can be prepared to say that we think it might be true, but it's not an absolute truth.
But you think some things are absolutely true, don't you?
Well, as in perhaps not my views on this or on other people.
That's fine. Make up your mind when you want to. But I've thought about it and I've come to a conclusion.
Okay,
I think it's true.
And just on that conclusion that you've drawn, this is the final question for me before we open up to the floor. When you sort of declare things saying that trans identity, is a fiction. Do you not think that you are kind of polarizing the discourse in the same way as your opponents? Because if you're literally saying that the concept of the sort of intellectual framework that their argument rests is literally fiction, literally unreal, is that not as much of an affront to free speech as people who say that your language is just unilaterally transphobic?
Look, am I polarizing the discourse? I'm definitely saying something that is very unpopular, as I'm sure you can all tell, amongst certain groups. In other groups, people find it more easy to accept. It's not... I just think that if we don't talk about reality, then we go wrong, basically. We can live in these worlds where we pretend without being specific about gender, it doesn't matter. Whatever you're pretending about, you can go about your life pretending for a while, but ultimately reality will hit you in the face at some point because it's reality and we don't build it with words or socially construct it through acts of will. It's out there, it's real, and I can think of myself as a man all I like, but ultimately I'm not going to be able to arm wrestle you very successfully. And that's not, maybe I don't know. I have been working out recently. But there are limits to my bodily abilities, there are limits to women's body abilities, and there are situations in which it's very difficult to overcome your body, no matter what you want, no matter how you feel. And that is what I want to be able to say. I'm afraid that I think it's important in some contexts that we say it, which is not to say you can't be immersed in fictions at other times. I'm very clear that's okay too. It's just that when you get lost in the fiction, you can't talk about reality anymore, we've got a problem.
As in, I think just the final thing before we open up the floor is as I would agree that obviously there are limits to bodies, but whether it is those limits that determine the identity of gender is the question, and that's sort of the question
I still don't really know what you mean by gender, because I give 4 definitions in the book, so which one is it?
As in gender being, what not as in, if as in not As in, I think the reason I'm struggling is because you can define gender in different ways, but as in it's something which is a social concept rather than perhaps a purely biological one. As in, I am not, there's a difference between Matthew, the makeup of my cells, and who I am as a person. There's a difference between the body and the person. And I think
that's
the same
dualism.
way.
That's Cartesian dualism.
No. But as in. Well, I think perhaps on that note we'll open up the questions to the floor.
Okay. So
yes.
I go and
just wait for a second.
Okay.
So, Professor, could you go to that box? Yeah.
Gosh, do I?
Yes.
Before I ask my question, I think I'd just like everyone in the room to applaud that discussion we heard just then, because I think that is what the union is about. And for my past 8 years of membership, I've never seen a president allow for dispatch boxes to be used by audience members to engage with an honourable speaker. So can we just thank both the president and Professor Stock today for the excellent discussion. My question, Professor, is very simple. If we look at the crowds outside and the campus that we see here today, I fear that we've entered into an era of a new cultural war, and when one end you have folks arguing incessantly that anything and all that they see as contravening their beliefs is violent, is oppressive, is subjugative, and is therefore something we ought to erase. On the other end, we also see folks saying that this is a debate about free speech, civil liberties, and the ontological essence of what this society is about. There's a lot of hyperboles, metaphors, exaggerations that, frankly, in my opinion, has diluted the quality of discourse that many philosophers, including yourself, over all these years have sought to maintain through rigorous argumentation and logic. So my question, going back to the pragmatic issue, is how can we solve this? How can we tackle this problem? And are we not potentially reifying the very phenomenon we're a part of? But on that note, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. How can we solve this? I think, I mean, it depends what you think the problem is, and I actually, I don't mind that protest. It wasn't traumatic for me. It was a bit of student, people in my generation would do things like that even. But generally what I find more worrying is when, institutions have sort of listened to the protesters and take that voice through into their institutions and then basically become propaganda machines for a particular point of view, and then everyone else in that institution feels they can't say what they want to say. And that's happening, I'm afraid, in lots of workplaces and universities. Maybe not this one, I don't know. But you're all doing a good job, as far as I can see. So I think the Higher Education Act has just come in, which is going to, it's unfortunate that the law had to be used, but it is going to impose a duty on universities to actively promote free speech. And I think that the public is generally becoming aware of this as an issue, but it's going to take some courage of people who really find certain conversations difficult. They're just going to have them and see that the world does not end when you have them. It's okay. We can disagree reasonably and still be friends. We can.
And then the second question, the member in the white shirt there.
Thank you. I suppose I have a question about cancel culture, and I know that's something that unfortunately you have experienced. And I wonder if you think that there are individuals who are using the trans movement to silence women that they just don't like and disagree with, and whether we should be worried about that, I suppose.
I think that's true of every political movement, because humans are social animals, and that means that they can be friendly to one another, but they can also be very unfriendly to one another, and people can be very competitive with each other, they can feel all sorts of animosity towards people, and it can be expressed through political high-toned stances when the deeper motivations are probably quite banal. So yes, I agree with you that some of cancel culture is just basic human atavistic nature expressing itself, yes.
Yes, the member there.
Professor Stock, firstly, what is this to meet you again? But I was gonna ask you something about physicality. But I want to push you in a slightly different direction. In your 2019, could I make it clear I support the argument you're making? I just have this problem. In your 2019 book, imagination, you talk about the imagination. No, I unfortunately didn't read it. I showed it first, forgot to come to your launch. But there seems to be an inconsistency, or maybe you could enlighten me, that if we are talking about physical reality here, but you talk about the imagination in the 2017 book. There seems to be a problem of the way you line your argument about the materiality of gender, and I want you now in this great room just to try and clarify the consistency of that logic.
Okay. Well, I don't think there is an inconsistency because, so in my 2019 book, which you all should buy and read, which is on imagination and fiction, I was concerned with the life of the mind, and I was very much concerned with immersing yourself in fiction, novels, films, theatre, and also everyday fictions. So in my book about material reality, I'm really saying, yes, there's a material reality out there that is not up to us in our minds, but nonetheless, we have this amazing capacity to construct fictions or to participate in other people's fictions in a way that sort of, I don't know, flies parallel to the earth sometimes. Yeah. Or we can use bits of the world to inform our fictions. Like I could make a story about this, whatever you call this thing, dispatch box, and turn it into something else. But I could use its physical properties to inform the way that I am imagining about it.
Well,
so I think that some of that is going on in transactionalism.
Well, you can see why certain people would say, hang on, you're talking about fiction, but you're kind of criticizing.
Well, people don't like it when you criticize their fictions, that's true.
So you're criticizing the idea that a person can call themselves one thing which may not be a fiction to them. And I'm not saying trans is a fiction. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying that if you talk about what I take to be the socially constructive fiction of fiction, and then you're critiquing social constructive vision, that seems to be less.
Okay. Well, maybe you're right. I'm not seeing it myself right now. I don't think there's a tension there, but you might be right.
Okay, thank you. And it was an honor to work with you.
Yes, next question. The member in the pink right at the back. Yes, you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking. One issue I find surrounding trans men particularly is that often at a vulnerable age, girls with eating disorders are often now told that they are trans men when they wish to become far thinner. And my question is, do you think issues around gender identity are too readily conflated with other psychological issues, including eating disorders?
Well, I think you don't have to go to me as the authority on that. You can read, for instance, Hannah Barnes' book, Time to Think, which is, she's a Newsnight journalist, and She's interviewed hundreds of people about what happened at the Tavistock Gender Identity Service and the Adolescent Service. And yes, I mean, I don't know, I have no evidence for the first thing you said, but yes, the second thing, that gender identity disorders in adolescents often cluster with other mental health conditions, and that just is a demonstrable fact. Now, then you need to talk about the causality. You know, I'm not making any claim about causality. I'm just saying that there is high levels of autism, there's high levels of eating disorders, and sometimes there's history of trauma, and there's all sorts of interesting patterns come out of that research that the clinicians at the time were paying absolutely no attention to, because this magic identity was supposed to just, you know, oh, we can make everything all right if you just socially transition and then medically transition. And so, yeah, that's very much a concern. And every clinician should be worried about that, as far as I'm concerned, and think about it, yes.
Yes, the development officer.
First of all, I'd just like to thank you for coming and for Matthew and the union for hosting you. I think in the wake of you being invited, there was a lot of controversy, one of that being for the union to, I guess, determine what can we talk about and what can we not. One of the realizations I came to was we all agree racism is bad because of legacies of colonialism and slavery, and anti-Semitism because of the Holocaust. If we look at recently or oppressed groups in the past, they have gained rights through serious and very harmful acts of violence. With the trans community and LGBTQ community outside today, and what we've seen on Twitter, they feel threatened by things you and other gender, like critical theorists believe. Whether that actually leads to violence or not is up to be questioned. But what I think my main question is, I've read your book, and if I understand it correctly, you do believe that some people do struggle with their gender and identity.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. If that is the case, and in the final chapter you say we need to look to a binary, a world where there's a grey area in the middle, and
less binary,
sorry, like a non-binary changing rooms or bathrooms or things like that. But some trans people do not believe in being non-binary. They believe they belong to a binary that they were not born in. And the idea that actually this grey zone is going to fix it all.
Oh, I don't think it'll fix it all.
Yeah, it doesn't
no, I
fit
agree
well
with you.
with them.
It doesn't fix it.
So my question in this case is, everyone in this room will know that we do not want harm or physical violence to come to anyone. We should be past that. I hope we are. But how do we then go and implement public policy that actually works for trans people who want to belong to a binary, not this non-binary state? Where does that leave women, cis women, in terms of their safety? Will it ever match up? Will they ever see eye to eye? Do you think it is possible? And in public policy, what can we do for young people to essentially either not kill themselves,
well, okay, I can talk about that
or
bit.
to find a place where they belong?
Okay, thank you. There's a lot in that. So you can't make everyone happy, I'm afraid. So that cannot be the aim of public policy, to make everyone happy. That's not safeguarding. Safeguarding is to avoid the worst possible things happening. And then that doesn't mean bad things won't happen. It doesn't mean people won't be unhappy. It doesn't mean people won't feel uncomfortable, I'm afraid. There's just no world in which some people don't feel uncomfortable. You might like there to be, but I don't see how you can do that. And certainly not, you can't cater to one group in particular, say we really want you to be comfortable, and it doesn't really matter how everyone else feels, because that's just not very fair. So I don't think we should look to public policy about changing rooms to sort out comfort, I'm afraid. I think we should just try and avoid the worst kinds of anticipatable, if that's a word, harms. And that's where safeguarding would be normally looking. What can we do? The young people thing, I mean, I think, again, for the suicide discussion has been incredibly irresponsibly weaponized, I'm afraid. And it's just not true that there's this vast cohort of people very likely to commit suicide unless we completely capitulate to everything that they think about themselves or want to believe about themselves. It's just not true. And even on the Tavistock gender identity website, and they are very, as we've seen, I think quite problematic, but very pro-trans and very affirmative. They say it's a myth that you're very likely to commit suicide if you're not affirmed. So we just need to get out of that. That's just not helpful. It's also irresponsible because talk about suicide terrifies parents, it terrifies teachers, and it can, in some cases, be contagious. Like Samaritans used to say, do not use the idea of suicide indiscriminately because it's not a simple fact. Every suicide has a number of causes, and to put it down to one cause and to say there's an easy solution is to be incredibly irresponsible. So I wouldn't worry about that. There is some evidence that in the trans-identified adolescent population, you're more likely to be suicidal, but you're something like 5 times more likely than the average. If you're autistic, you're like much more likely. If you're a girl, if you're a lesbian, it erases you. So we need to look at the whole thing and not just this one narrow aspect which you hear about all the time. Life is complicated, we are complicated, so we need to look at the complexity.
Yeah. Everyone has the right to a follow-up question. The question is exercising that right. So could everyone put their hands down, please? Thank you.
Okay. Just finally, I think my last difficulty in this whole sort of debate and in like hosting this event as a committee member has been, you are now and have been someone who has spoken out on these issues, and even more so now as in your book sales have gone through the roof. With that, you have become a voice of gender critical theorists, and a lot of people are looking to you to represent cis women, gay women, in a way, or the sort of a group of people who are skeptical, who are unsure where they fall with allowing trans women certain rights into changing rooms and whatever. With you calling people on Twitter babies, do you feel one time?
And the context.
Can I finish? I understand the context, and I have struggled heavily with people accusing me of certain things being transphobic or whatever. What the issue is by you doing that, you then
should be more responsible.
Cut off any sort of, no, they're a professor, they're an academic, they have an OBE. You then alienated...
Well, I'm not a professor anymore, so...
alienated a group of people who were looking for some sort of representation in this argument. Do you feel in any way that calling people babies even once ruins your legitimacy?
Look, no. I mean, the thing is, I can't help what's projected onto me, and there are people that know me that know that this is not actually my natural home, as it were, and I'm afraid that I think that the whole discourse from radical feminism to trans activism could chill out. I really do think that. And I think we can laugh, and we can also, we're resilient enough to cope when someone calls us babies. And God knows I am called everything under the sun all the time. So really, I'm not going to, you want some you want me to be more po-faced and more authoritative and speak for, I'm not here to speak for any community. I keep saying I don't speak for lesbians, I don't speak for women. I'm just here to say what I think. And if you disagree, I want to hear it and open up a space for other people to say what they think and to look at evidence and not just make shit up. But that's kind of my area.
Yeah, thank you for that.
The member in the black dress in the third row. Who is the? Yeah.
Firstly, thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Matthew, for hosting. So you said at the very beginning of your speech you're not a fanatic, and I'm afraid I haven't read your book. I wasn't really sure what you were going to say, and I was really struck by how very moderate and reasonable and quite sensible a lot of the arguments you're making today were. And yet, a lot of the reactions and protests today have been very much as though you are a fanatic and as though you are sort of like this trans-hating bogeyman. But why do you think there is such a visceral reaction against what you're saying? Because as a member and as an audience member, I was kind of a bit confused because it seemed quite disproportionate. And as someone who didn't know what you were all about, I've come now, and again,
it's a very good question. I mean, I'm actually very moderate. I get flack from gender critical feminists for being too moderate. You know, I mean, I'm not. We do not speak with one voice. There's huge amounts of animosity and within radical feminism and gender critical feminism about things like pronouns and God knows what. Well, firstly, most people out there have not read my book, or even perhaps watched a long-form interview with me where I've said all this sort of thing hundreds of times. But what they have done is gone to people's blog posts about me, or snippets on the internet, or, you know, there are people who hoover up all my tweets. So somebody, you know, has just referred to a tweet that I probably dashed off after a glass of wine and didn't think twice of. There are people there hoovering up my tweets to generate narratives about how evil I am. You know, she said this, she said that, you know. So that, I take it that's their source. I don't think the media reports very responsibly. I think that the Guardian and the BBC a couple of years ago at least was still describing my view as anti-trans or transphobic even, and it wasn't as far as I was concerned, or at least you got to question that. And this narrative is just built and built and built. And I also think it actually, they kind of want me to be evil because they want a baddie. And I'm afraid I'm the baddie, but, you know, I'm a really shit baddie. I really am terrible. But, you know, you need every hero's journey needs a dragon to slay. And maybe they think I'm the dragon.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yes, the member, Rachel.
So when you talk about, you know, violence committed by, you know, in prisons and that, do you not believe that you're using exceptions to prove rules? I want you to explain to me how your logic differs from the community of men, for example, who cite one woman who falsely accuses a man of rape. As I want to see how those exceptions and that logic that they use is different from yours.
Well, what do they say about this one woman?
So also there are very few instances of women falsely accusing men of rape, and there's a community of people who have used those few examples to prove or to suggest that rape is, there are so many high instances of rape being falsely accused, or, you know, you can't trust rape accusations. Do you not see your logic as the same, as following the same lines?
So there's two just analogies I can think of the top of my head. One is that the context in which I discuss single-sex spaces and what we should do there and how we should arrange them is safeguarding. Now, there is a wider sense of safeguarding. You should safeguard men from false accusations of rape, or you should safeguard women from false accusations of rape, you know. So yeah, it's safeguarding in a wider sense. The question is what we do about those two things, and there's just not as neat a solution as single-sex spaces for that second issue. So I'm not saying, you know, you shouldn't put me in this binary. I either care about this or I care about that. I care about both, but there seems like a much more well-established solution in the first case than there was in the second. The other thing is, I'm going to say, I'm afraid I have to refer you back to those statistics. 50% is not one.
I mean, if you look at freedom of information reports for British prisons, for example, out of over 100 cases of sexual assault within prisons, only 5 were committed by transgender prisoners. To me, that appears quite rather in a small proportion an exception.
I'm talking about convictions for trans people in prisons, what they were convicted of to get them into prison. And the context of this was that the claim was originally, something magic happens when people say, a male says he's a woman, he somehow opts out of the pattern. I'm saying, well, if 50% of the trans women in prison are there because they've got a conviction for sexual assault, then that shows that magic does not happen.
But I thought we weren't talking about prior to prison, we're talking about actually being in the prison.
No, well, there is obviously a difficulty in putting a sexual predator in a female prison if they've got a conviction for rape, I would say.
Yes, the member just here.
Thank you very much for that. So a few months ago, I believe you spoke out against the proposed ban on conversion therapy for transgender individuals, on the concern that it might force them to medically transition. Given the exceptionally harmful way in which conversion therapy has been employed around the world and historically for homosexual youths. I just wanted to kind of justify why you maybe don't agree with that framework being in place.
Yeah, of course. So conversion therapy is a very emotive term, and it's deliberately used to be emotive because it's deliberately used to conjure up images in people's heads of people being forcibly held down and prayed over and the terrible things that have happened to gay people, and still do. But when you drill down into detail of this idea that we should ban conversion therapy for trans-identified people, it potentially includes therapy, just paying a counsellor or going to a psychologist or going to a psychotherapist for an adolescent to talk through, so an adolescent, so just read the Hannah Barnes book. An adolescent presents at the Gender Identity Service and says, I think I'm a boy. Or I believe a boy. I know I'm a boy. I've always been a boy. I'm a boy trapped in the wrong body. The therapist wants to say, okay, are there background factors here that we should explore? Are you autistic? I'm not going to say this because that's not what therapists do, but are they autistic? Have they got eating disorders? Have they got a history of trauma? Are they confused? Because sometimes, children have developmental delay and they might have category problems in categorizing things. Can the therapy do any of that? Or will it count as converting them out of the gender identity that they have? And what the push is from trans-activist organizations is to say, you must affirm. The therapist just affirms. They say, oh, that's your gender identity? Great, let's affirm you. That's not, so I don't think what I just described is conversion therapy. I think it is totally sensible, therapeutic, sensitive exploration of sometimes confused and troubled and distressed adolescents before they make irrevocable decisions with their bodies that we're now seeing in their 20s and 30s, some of whom regret, severely regret. So that's all that the ban on conversion therapy really means.
I think there's still a concern from a lot of people, though, that by not having some form of legislative framework, there's going to be major concern that parents who don't accept the fact their child is trans, and they are trans,
what does they are trans mean?
That's a very good point. Just the idea that somebody, I'm trying to think how to put it.
You can't tell
and that's,
from looking
I agree,
the ones that are going to be happy and the ones that aren't. And that's your child. And it's their body. The body they might want to have a baby with or to have an orgasm with, because some of these drugs stop orgasm. So this is not like mucking about. This is serious shit. And I just think it's a scandal that it's been dressed up as so somehow my side is the baddies for wanting a bit of a pause to allow children, many of them gay, to express who they are.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but please join me in thanking Professor Stock for taking the time and for what's been a very interesting discussion.